Well, excited to be sitting down with Christina Rangel. Christina is the founder, director of United Justice, and we're going to get into all that. We're going to talk a lot about what they're doing. Again, we're highlighting or trying to take a deep dive into the issue of what we call like a global refugee crisis, which obviously isn't to suggest every city in the planet is experiencing a refugee crisis, but there are a lot of displaced people groups on the planet right now, and I think there's like different opinions on what should happen with the refugee crisis. And we want to just, as Justice Collective, we want to do a good job of talking to people that are actually doing work in particular spaces of need. We don't want to really do the theory thing, but when we talk to leaders, we feel like it's such a good opportunity to get educated, have our eyes open, and then also, to hear about their work, and maybe the result of these kinds of conversations can be us getting behind people like Christina and contributing strength. So it's good to see you, Christina. Christina and I go, I want to say way back,
It's
but
pretty far back.
I don't know how many years.
I mean, probably close to like 8 or 9.
Yeah, okay. That feels like way
Long
back.
time. That's a chunk.
That feels like some history. Christina, I'll probably just get all sappy if I start talking about the history. When I met Christina, like she's really the catalytic person in my life for actualizing what I felt like the Lord was speaking to me about in terms of engaging in the anti-trafficking space. I met Christina within a few months of the Lord talking to me about it, and that's a big part of her story. She's a survivor. She's come from that. Um, so she really helped me get going and has been a mentor, a friend, a colleague. We've worked on stuff together. But let's talk about what you're doing now, and let's start right there. Like, what do you say to people that are like refugee crisis? What are you talking about? And because it can be a polarizing subject, and I typically don't like to do the cultural like let's get in a fight. I just like to like, well, no, let's just like talk as Jesus people. But you're working in this space.
Yeah.
What's your view of like displaced people groups, and if there is such a thing as a refugee crisis? Start talking from that point, and then we'll get going. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It can become a very, very complicated subject because it can be so polarizing, especially politically and people's beliefs politically. And I mean, I think it's really important that when we talk about like a refugee, the global refugee crisis in the world, that it can become very general, because the Syrian refugee crisis is very different from the Venezuelan refugee crisis, from the Central American refugee crisis. And then when you talk about who's crossing whose borders, it becomes a whole nother level of, does this issue even matter? Is this a crisis, or is it just normal for the region? And then it becomes really complicated when you're trying to talk about it. And so we work in South America, so United Justice works with Venezuelan refugee and immigrants. We also work inside Venezuela with people that haven't left yet. And so when I talk about it, it's especially up here in the States, people are like, what do you mean Venezuela? What's going on in Venezuela? No, there's only a refugee crisis in Syria or in the Middle East. And what's been really interesting to see working in South America, because what's happening in Venezuela is a crisis. It's affected every nation in South America, most of Central America, Mexico, and now we're seeing record numbers of Venezuelan immigrant and refugees crossing through Mexico and crossing the Mexico-US border.
Wow.
But the world is not, I have to say this carefully, the international community is not looking at it as the same type of crisis as in Syria, because there's not any bombs dropping. So the first time I visited the border in Colombia, the Colombian-Venezuelan border, it was like, where is UNICEF? Where is the UN? Where is the Red Cross? And the lady from the Red Cross that was there right on the border they were giving free vaccinations for Venezuelan immigrants, but that was the only resources that they had. She told me, well, they're not at war. So under international law, it's not really a refugee crisis. So there's no funding for it. where there's funding for the ones in the Middle East or some refugee crisis in Africa because bombs are dropping. And it's a declared war between civil groups or between countries. And what's happening in South America, that it's different. And so it gets really tricky, right? Like, what is a refugee crisis? What's considered, are they immigrants or are they refugees? What is the difference between these two people groups? How do we identify them? How do we resource them? So yeah, it's definitely this is like our United Justice saying is it's complicated. It's like, what's going on? Well, it's complicated. What's going on with that? Well, it's complicated. But it's real and real lives are being affected. And I always get a sense of relief when I come across somebody that's from South America, because I'm like, oh, like you understand. Because I had this call with someone from Argentina about something completely unrelated to any of this. And as soon as he told me, oh, I'm from Argentina, I was like, oh my gosh, tell me about the Venezuelans in Argentina. And then it was like this 2-hour conversation of this crisis, the weight that it's putting on Argentina, but you don't really know unless you go, because it's not being talked about or publicized as it should.
And what an interesting distinction. So if bombs aren't dropping, that's really telling. And I can understand people in leadership, the idea and that position. So describe to us and those that are taking part in this moment, the difference between a refugee scenario crisis where bombs are dropping and what we're seeing currently in South America as the result of what's happening in Venezuela. Like, talk about what is the crisis, talk about why there are so many displaced people groups. My hunch is people don't leave a safe place. Yeah. They leave a place that's not safe, or they leave it, so yeah, clue us in.
So Venezuela is it started with an economic crisis. I'm like, how far back do we go into this? It's technically classified as an economic crisis, which is why it's not the refugee war crisis, right? So their entire economy was backed by oil. Oil prices dropped. You couple that with their prior president. I did a year-long research project on how did this actually happen. It was like, how did it happen? So I don't want to bore you with too many details, but their previous president went through a very strategic and intentional process with the country to rewrite their constitution and strip the Supreme Court of all of their power, and to consolidate it to make their judicial system a non-independent judicial system, which is a whole different subject. And so what that did when he passed away from cancer, and what that did is his successor had all the power. Oil prices dropped, sanctions come from the United States, which I'm telling you, it gets very, very complicated. They couldn't feed their people. And so 100% of the refugees that we work with in Colombia and Ecuador are like, I was literally starving. And we have several people in our programs that they left Venezuela after their kids starved to death. Like their children like died from starvation after being Venezuela just 10 years ago was the most prosperous and most developed country in South America. And so you have this huge crash from, I like to compare it to nations like Haiti, where unfortunately and sadly, Haiti has been in the state that it's been in for a long time. Now, Venezuela, just a few years ago, was compared to places like the United States and was called the United States of South America and Latin America. And now they are on the verge of being declared a failed state by the UN, which is what Haiti is. So they're at the same level as Haitians. So our programs in Venezuela are aimed towards trying to keep people there, and which is very controversial and is really hard for us to also swallow every day when we wake up. But we also see how hard it is for them when they leave. So, I mean, getting them resourced inside Venezuela is extremely difficult because many of them don't have electricity. There's no there's water only a couple times a week and it comes through, looks like chocolate milk. I mean, basic services are gone. There is no education system, there is no health system, there's all of these things began to crumble under a lot of different economic powers.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sanctions from the United States and Western Europe on Venezuela because of their allies with Iran and North Korea and China and Russia and Cuba. And so because of that, there's a lot more. So they can't import food, they can't grow food. It gets very, very complicated. So people are leaving. And prior to the pandemic, and where we work in Colombia on the border, there were 20,000 Venezuelans crossing this one border crossing every day into Colombia, every single day. And now with the pandemic, the border is closed, but there is still, they think that there's 20 to 30,000 crossing every day, but they're crossing through illegal paths. They're called las trochas, and they pass through these illegal paths into Colombia and then walk down into Peru and Argentina, Chile. They're all over the place. So what's interesting is in the first wave of this exodus out of Venezuela was usually the teenage boys and men, because they were going to look for work. And now they're not finding work, especially in the pandemic. They weren't really finding much work because these other South American countries didn't have the ability to take in all of these people. Colombia is barely surviving on their own. The peace agreement in Colombia with the FARC and the government was only in 2016. And so they're still trying to recover from their own decades of civil war and wars with the drug cartels, and they can't take in 2 million Venezuelans and try to give them jobs and opportunities and school systems. And so it's started to, cripple the other nations, but the moms and the kids that were left behind weren't getting, their husbands and sons weren't getting jobs in other countries. They're not being able to send money home. And so now they're having to leave. So the last couple of years, we've seen a huge increase in women and children crossing the border into Colombia and going to other countries. And a high percentage of them are ending up in sexual exploitation. And so it's I could easily say every city in every country in South America has a Venezuelan refugee living in it. Every major city in every country in South America has Venezuelan victims of sexual exploitation.
Wow. And from what you're discovering, is that highly organized, or is that pretty centralized, localized, individual pimps and traffickers, or are you even seeing organized crime in that? Probably both, right? But
yeah, what we really see that's the most devastating is it's really easy. It's really easy for girls. It's like a buffet choice. You want a trafficker that can take care of you and give you a home, pay for your kids' daycare, or do you want to just work on your own and try to figure it out on your own with no, safety and protection from the buyers? And there's also cities that we work in Colombia where they'll work in a park, and the park is owned by one trafficker, and then you pay rent to the trafficker to work in prostitution in that park for the day or for the week. And there's a certain fee that each of them are charging, so it's wild. It's like they have all of these different options, or they can work in the cantinas, like the bars, just for the night and pay a fee to the bar owners to be able to work in this bar that's actually a brothel. There's marketplaces where you can work in the daytime, and those are the daytime markets, like the markets where you go buy groceries, are full of Venezuelan victims of sexual exploitation. And those ones are more organized because it's like a public family type place, where you're going grocery shopping. And so those girls are a lot harder to get in contact with and be able to resource, because they are being watched, and that is much more organized crime, very sophisticated, very dangerous situation.
Yeah. And this is I think if you go deep and you think about the issue, it makes a lot of sense. Wow, people that are vulnerable are exploitable. But you getting into this space, I know your story. You didn't foresee this. Like you didn't foresee that you'd be working in this kind of an area. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you stumbled into this, how really the Lord directed you?
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful story of just saying yes to Jesus, and which we really want to always promote that here. Like say
Yeah.
yes to Jesus. He'll put you where you're supposed to be. And
Yeah.
if your heart's burning to make a difference, like he's got a plan.
Yeah.
So do you want to go backwards a little bit? Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been, like you said, been working in anti-trafficking for a long time. I'm a survivor of trafficking. I've been working in anti-trafficking for, I don't know, probably like, I don't even know, 14 years, 13 years, something like that, a long time. Had different, done a lot of different things in different countries and a lot of different levels and lots of trainings and serving other organizations and trying to do stuff in Reading and, all kinds of everything, right?
Yeah.
And I was really in a place where I was getting frustrated because I felt like we could only get to a certain level of influence or change or transformation because we didn't have all the tools. And I didn't have the education that I needed to be able to get to the places of influence that I felt like we needed to get to be able to make systemic transformation. And so it's like 10 years of resourcing girls out of outreach, you start to realize like, how do we actually change this? Because I have really good job security doing this, right? So how do we make it so that I don't have a job in this anymore? And so I was really in this place of praying and, after being at Bethel for 10 years, like, what do I do next? God, what is my direction? And I've always, being a survivor, I've always held it very lightly in my hands, always before the Lord. Like, I don't want to be doing anti-trafficking because I can, because I'm a survivor. I want to do it because this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I felt like I was at a crossroad. Like, am I switching? Am I not doing? What is going on? I was feeling really, and so I felt like I needed to go back to school, like to the university. And so I did that and I started taking classes and I was doing that. But I was really feeling like, God, what is next? And I had a dream. And in the dream, I don't remember the dream actually at all. I woke up from the dream and I was yelling, like in the middle of the night, like yelling out loud, the answer is in Venezuela. And this was probably, oh my gosh, what year are we in? 2021. This was probably 5 years ago, maybe even 6 years ago. And so I'm yelling, like, the answer is in Venezuela. The answer is in Venezuela. And I mean, this would be like putting myself out there. I had never heard of Venezuela before. I didn't even know where it was. I did not know it was in South America. I didn't know a single thing about it. And so I woke up in the morning and it was like, that was so weird. I had never had that experience before. And so I just started researching like Venezuela, where's Venezuela? Oh, it's in South America. Okay, what's going on in Venezuela? And it's like, this is when the refugee crisis was really getting strong. They had already been leaving Venezuela for a couple years before that, but it was about 6 years ago that it was like, oh, people are starting to actually kind of pay attention to what's going on here. And so I was like obsessed. I could not get enough information. I ordered every book I could read on Venezuela, the history of Venezuela. Everywhere I went was like, do you know what's going on in Venezuela? Do you know what's going on in Venezuela? I'd hear people speaking Spanish in the store and I'd be like, are you from Venezuela? Do you know anybody from Venezuela? And it was like literally, Lance, for like 3 years, I was like on this mission and I could not find a single person from Venezuela. And so in the meantime, I got, I moved to the Bay Area to finish my degree. And I went to the Mexican grocery store down the street from my house, and this girl, I have a recipe for mole. My husband's Mexican. And so he sends me to the store with this recipe, and he's like, I need these things for it. So I get there and there's something on there. I don't know what it is. So I asked the checkout girl, I'm like, hey, what is this? I don't even know what it is. Do you have this? And she's like, oh, I'm not Mexican. Let me go ask somebody. So she comes back. She's like, well, it's a squash thing, but we don't have that. We get more inventory on Tuesdays. I'm like, okay, whatever. So she's like ringing up my stuff. And so just to make like small talk, I'm like, oh, where are you from? And she's like, oh, I'm from Venezuela. And I was like, oh my God, I almost like jumped over the counter. This poor girl was probably like this weird lady, and she spoke like broken English. This is something I forgot to say, but right after I had the dream,
Yeah.
because in my heart I was like, okay, God, I believe you. You know, I'm looking for direction for my life and what I'm going to do next. And you're telling me the answers in Venezuela and they speak Spanish. So the next week I enrolled in Spanish classes. And so it was like, I'm going to learn Spanish. And people tell me, why don't you just have someone translate? And I was like, no, because if I'm working with survivors from Venezuela, I want to be able to connect with them directly. I don't want it to go through a translator. So the second hardest thing I've done in my whole life is learn Spanish. I'm like years in, and I'm still like, how do you say that? No, I'm a lot better now. But so
Well, I'm interrupting the story. I just want to know how the mole was.
I was good.
Like, is that because I've heard it's good? Like, Javi makes a good mole.
Yeah, he does. It was good. It's not my favorite Mexican dish, but he does good.
Okay. So back to the grocery store. You guys you're blown away. Somebody from Venezuela.
Yeah, it's like the first person. It's literally
for years, and here she
years.
is.
Yeah. So I'm just like, oh my gosh, who are you? I'm like, who, you know, can we meet? Can we meet for coffee? And she's like, sure. So the next day we meet for coffee, and she we're still really good friends.
Wow.
She is a lawyer from Venezuela that came here for 6 months to work to send money back home because there was no jobs there. So she was my first contact into Venezuela, and she's helped us with paperwork in Latin America. She's helped consult the organization. I mean, she's just this absolutely beautiful, amazing, wonderful person that is stuck in the middle of this crazy crisis, you know, that's like, do I leave or do I stay? And so that kind of started this, you know, and then I can't get into Venezuela because I'm American. They don't let it. There's a lot of issues there, very, very complicated. We won't get into, but I can't get in. So a friend and I, Belen, who's also a BSSM graduate, she was in my city services and stuff that I was leading when I was at Bethel. She lives in Ecuador, and we, you know, stayed in contact and are really good friends. And I told her, you know, let's just go to the border. Like, let's just get as close to Venezuela as we possibly can to see what is going on. And so we showed up with no contacts. We didn't know anybody. We're just like, I just wanted to see what was happening. And God was so faithful. The next day we made a contact with a Colombian guy that built a clinic right on the border for Venezuelan moms and children that are crossing the borders because the kids are coming over really malnourished, uneducated, very, very sick. And so he was also a lawyer, quit his job to open this clinic to serve this population. He's connected to the Colombian government. So the Colombian military took us out into the jungles to see the Venezuelans that were being trafficked into the jungles of Colombia, that were, you know, being trafficked into the cocoa farms and then sex trafficked at night. And like, oh my gosh, it's just crazy what happened in those days. And ever since then, we just started building programs. Here are the gaps. Here's a connection. Here's this. And so every couple months now, Belen goes once a month to Colombia, and we have our programs inside Venezuela because we started seeing how hard it is for the Venezuelans to get jobs or opportunities outside. They don't have documents. There's racism or xenophobia is so strong. You know, it's all the same issues you kind of deal with refugees in any kind of country. And the Colombians don't want them there. The Ecuadorians, the Peruvians don't want them there. They're taking their jobs. It's all the same narratives that you hear from a lot of other immigration and refugee issues. And so we started thinking, okay, well, what if we do programs inside Venezuela to try to prevent them from having to leave? So, sorry, okay. So complicated. I mean, we can't find gasoline one week. The next week, we don't have any propane to cook the kids' food because there's no propane in the country. The next week, there's no water. So we can't cook because there's no water services. Then there's no electricity. So we can't do because we're doing an education program. And then it's like, we have no internet. We have no lights. We have, you know, we're teaching these kids math with candles. And it's like, one challenge after another. But it is crazy now that I tell the whole story all at once, right? Because it started with the yes, like I had this dream and I believed it, you know. And I remember one time, a long time ago, when you were doing Justice House, is that what it was called?
Yeah.
Justice House, yeah. And Lyle Phillips came And it was one of the first times that I had been to Justice House. I mean, this was a long time ago, like 8 years ago. And you brought Lyle Phillips to come and talk about what he did in India. And I remember you asked him something along the lines of like, how do you change the world, or how do you bring transformation? And he said, you have to believe in what you're doing. No matter what it is you're doing, you have to believe in it. And that stuck with me all of these years. And so when I had the dream, it was like, I can't meet any Venezuelans. I don't know where Venezuelans are. I don't even know how to get there. I don't know, but I know they speak Spanish, and I'm going to believe in this. And so this is what I can do for this, to show God that I'm saying yes. And you can trust me with this answer to my prayers. And so I started learning Spanish, which was not easy, and it took so much commitment. And still to this day, I'm like, I can't wait to see Jesus. I'm going to be like, why? Grammar rule 527. Why? Why is this like this? No, but I think it's so important that we, even with all I had the experience in trafficking, I had the experience. I had already done the work. I was a survivor of trafficking, and I still started at step one. And I feel like the favor and the favor and the crazy open doors that God has given us, and the platform that he's given us in Latin America, and the amount of money that he has given us to be able to do the work, is because from the very beginning, it was, none of us from the beginning days were entitled to anything. It was like, okay, I'm going to learn Spanish. And then, I'm going to look for, and that's years, Lance, like years believing and learning Spanish, believing in what I'm doing, that I'm going to use it, that I'm going to need this Spanish one day to connect with survivors on the ground in Venezuela, and then the next step. And then after years, the next door opens, and then the next door opens. And then it all comes together in this beautiful, crazy, and honestly, all my team, I'm the only American on the team. They're all of our staff are either Venezuelan, Colombian, or Ecuadorian. But United Justice would not be able to be doing what it's doing if I didn't speak Spanish, because only a few people on our team speak English, and most of them is very broken English. And so I have to run meetings and events and staff meetings and programs and projects and fundraisers and all of those things. And it just wouldn't be possible to do that through translation. And God knew that. And I needed the 3 years to study Spanish to be able to do what we're doing now, so maybe it's not a language, but it seemed like a small, and people, I can't tell you how many people would be like, why are you spending so much time trying to learn Spanish? There's so many Spanish speakers in the world, like you can get a translator. But to me, it was like, if I encounter a girl, I want to be able to connect to her. Like, I want to ask her, are you okay? And I want to be able to understand her. Not that it has to all come down to me, but when we go out with the team, I don't want to be the only one that can't connect with people, because that's my heart in all of this. It's, yes, we want to build programs and resource them and educate them, but I want to connect them to their heart, to, okay, what is going on? Are you okay? This is what we need. This is how we need to get her out of here. You're going to be okay. You're with us. You can trust us. All of those conversations that doesn't work through a translator, So I think it was a very humbling lesson for me to learn to, after all those years, I started from square one again, and I think that's important for us to remember, those of us that believe in the direction from the Lord and the subtle, like I didn't get another confirmation from God. I had the one dream and I ran with it, and I believed it. I believed God, and I believed in what I was doing, and I have not looked back. So
yeah, I love it. So let's go into that space of like systemic change, holistic solution. It's complicated. And when people are bringing up their issues in the earth, like, oh, refugees, and they're upset about whatever, like, how do we fix this? Like, it's never really as simple as, okay, here's how you fix it. But it is always as simple as that, as your yes, like you're describing, like a yes to the Lord who does have a solution, and kind of like partnering with him in whatever it is he's doing. Um, what have you learned? Because I know you're not just running at this with like, yeah, I love Jesus and I want to help. I know you're like pursuing education.
Yeah.
You're networking at like pretty high levels, government and whatever. Talk to people that don't know, like what have you learned about holistic solution in a refugee crisis? Again, it's the Venezuelan context,
Yeah.
but
In any, yeah, it's
there
very,
may be a different context than Syria, so maybe holistic solution looks very different. But I would assume there's probably some similarities and some themes. So I would love, I feel like we got another 10 or 10 plus minutes. I would love to just hear, you got a ton of wisdom because you're experiencing a bunch. What
yeah.
is change looking like, you know?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that we've learned, so I graduated and I'm going for my master's in international law of human rights, because what I've learned is the people on the ground need to be the ones that have a voice and higher up, because it's really easy for the people higher level to make policies, solutions. We're not sending any money because bombs aren't dropping, and on paper that makes sense.
Yeah.
But for the people on the ground, bringing starving children across the border, 20,000 a day, it doesn't make any sense. It's like, okay, well, when the first bomb drops, then you're going to come help these people. Well, then we have, it's a whole different level of complicated, right? Because now you're at war, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, why are we waiting until things are exploding, right?
Yeah. Hey, congratulations on graduating with your degree. That's so amazing. I know it was a journey, and that's amazing to hear you're pursuing a master's in international law, human what?
Rights, international law of human rights.
Okay, wow,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah. And that's because I think we need to take the Venezuelan economic crisis to the international courts. I'm like, we will take this case to the international court system in Central America and Costa Rica, the Inter-American Court there for Latin America. And we are also going to take it to The Hague in Europe, because it's an international human rights crisis that's happening. But the people that need to be doing that are the people that are also on the ground.
Yeah.
And historically in the church, there's a huge disconnect there, right?
Yeah.
Like you're either the missionary on the ground in the trenches, or you're the educated person that loves Jesus and you work over there in that fancy law office and you're that. And maybe there's some communication between the two, but it's never the same person.
Yeah.
And so I'm very huge in believing that and this is what I've learned in this. It was like, oh, we're going to go in and we're going to rescue girls and we're going to bring transformation. We're going to educate the kids and we're going to do all these things. And I'm like, it's the same scenario as it was working with girls in the States or in Mexico. It was like, this is job security, what we need to do. And so when I started looking at the international legal system and where do they get the laws from? Where is this customary law coming from? What basis do we need to have to take this case to the international court? It was like, oh, well, nobody can do that right now because they don't have any data from on the ground, but I have data from on the ground. I'll give you all the data that I have on the ground, but nobody up there wants that data because there's a disconnect and they're working on the Syrian or the African or all of these different things. So I'm like, okay, it's going to be us, little United Justice. We are small, but we are mighty, and we are going to take this thing all the way there. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to apply for this, master's at Oxford, and I'm going to do this and I'm going to go for it while simultaneously not taking my eyes off the ground of people. And how I feel like, it's overwhelming. It is absolutely, any refugee crisis is overwhelming when you get it and you see it with your eyes and you're talking to the people. And I have taken several different NGOs down to Cucuta, the Colombian Venezuelan border, to show them, because I'm like, until you actually see it with your eyes, you're not going to understand what I'm telling you. And when they get there, they're like, oh my gosh, I've worked all over the world. This is so overwhelming. It is so, like, I can't do anything about this. And so, I think being on the ground, what we've learned, I mean, we knew this before, but what we were reminded is it is the person in front of you, right? Right now, we have these 30 girls in our program that come to the center in Colombia every day. And if we make a difference in their lives, I know there's 20,000 new ones that just crossed into the city today, and I'm just trying to just like focus on these 30 girls or these 50 girls, or, you know, it's like making a difference in their life while simultaneously making a difference at a higher level is what brings change.
How do you like describe that vacuum, you know, the disconnect from the top to the ground level? I mean, I think it's so normal in power structures for there to be that separation. But what are you learning about how to bridge that gap? Is it just I have to get educated and go be up top? Or because I know that there are leaders at high levels of leadership, government and otherwise, that care.
Yeah.
I know there are those that don't care, but I know that there are those that care. Have you encountered or like stumbled into anything that shows, wow, that, you know, we can bridge the gap and we can bring kind of top down, bottom up change?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because I think one thing that I've learned with, you know, reaching out to authorities in Colombia is that a lot of them care, or even here, higher level up, they do care. But the route that it takes you to get there and to get on the ground is very different. And most of those people started that route because they cared and wanted to bring a difference, bring transformation, right? They wanted to make a difference. And then they go this and they get educated, then they get a job, they get experience, they get promoted, and then they're here. And then pretty soon there's this huge gap. And then the road to the trenches is completely different as well. A lot of them come straight out of school or a different type of career, not normally, you know, and then they go straight to the ground and they start working in the trenches. And they, you know, it's not just the fault of the people in higher, you know, in higher power structures being disconnected from the work on the ground. It's also the people on the ground being uneducated to understand the resources and connections that we need to be having and plugging into for the people that are higher up. And so I think that there, you know, it's both sides to come and meet in the middle. And for me, the connections that I've had gotten, you know, even here in the Bay Area with people that are like, you know, very high up in tech and wanting to do opportunities, and your organization looks great, can we teach them coding and these type of things? I'm like, yeah, but you have to come with me.
Wow.
You have to come. It's hot. It's dirty. There are no regulations. You've never been anywhere like this. I know you go to Fiji on the weekends, but if you want to work with United Justice and create opportunities, you have to come to Colombia with me, because you have to see it. And that brings a connection that isn't emotional, that is real. That's like, oh my God, this situation is really hard and it's really complicated and it's really overwhelming, but we still have the ability to make a difference. And I think that's important, right? And for the people on the ground, I'm like, oh my gosh, education, I say it all the time, but I'm like, it has changed the way getting a degree and studying this stuff with all my heart has changed the way that I view real issues in the world, and opened a whole world of resources for us to be able to bring transformation that I would have never known existed.
Wow. What was your path? Like, what did you get your bachelor's degree in?
It's in Spanish and human rights. So I have a double major. Yeah.
I love that. You're talking about proximity and like shrinking that gap. And to me, that sounds a lot like God. Like God is not separate. Maybe not
Totally.
having a relationship with God. People assume God is far off and whatever, holier than thou. And but like God's like always shrinking the gap and coming down and connecting and relating, and I like he's the one that knows the plight of those that are suffering, and he's intimate with that. He's intimate with that journey that people are caught up in, and it's interesting. Like to me, that proximity is empowerment. It's anointing. It's like it's compassion. It's love, and
Yeah.
you can wane in love when you're not close to real situations of need, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, you start to get insulated
Yeah.
and maybe eventually isolated, and yeah. Well, this is amazing. There's so much good stuff here. It's always so refreshing talking to you, Christina. What do people do if they want to learn more about United Justice? Maybe they want to contribute in whatever way, just to pray for you guys, or maybe they want to hook you guys up with some kind of connection they have, or resources, or it sounds like they'd have to go with you to the border.
Like, if you want to do something, you're going with
I
me.
want to go. I want to go to the border with you. Christina.
Come on.
I don't know that I could like bring you many resources to back up with that, but I want to go.
You can come. You can come.
Okay,
Yeah. So yeah, we have a website. You can connect with us on Instagram. We have Facebook. We're not super active on Facebook, but definitely our Instagram, or messaging on Instagram if you wanted to get connected or to see. We're pretty active on Instagram, just showing about our programs and what we're doing and building. And our website, or my email, like I'm easy to find. I'm not hard to find.
What's your website?
ujustice.org.
Okay, and your Instagram is
United.justice.
great. United.justice.
Yep.
Cool. I don't typically do this in these moments, but I just want to pray for you guys. Like when we're doing these interviews, I don't usually pray for you guys, but I want to pray for you right now. Father, thank you for United Justice. Thank you for the team around Christina. Thank you for what it is you have invited them into. And I just thank you for real refreshing and real strength. Like you would just pour onto her family, and her team, refreshing strength. I just see like even a new insight on impact. I just see like strategy unfolding to be even more hitting the target. I know you guys are already hitting the target, but I just feel like there'll be another level of strategic insight to be that much more on point with what God's building in Venezuelans through you guys. And yeah, I just see him resourcing you and refreshing you. Yeah, thanks for Christina, Lord. Thanks for United Justice.
Thank you so much, Lance. This was
Yeah,
awesome.
so good to catch up, and just thank you for what you're doing. It's such an inspiration to me, and I know to so many others that are going to be exposed to what you're up to. And I'm going to officially say goodbye. And Christina.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bless you.
Bye.